Okay, it's chapter 19, the heart. First two slides are just real basic stuff about the heart. Nothing fancy here. You can read that yourself. So again, this chapter focuses on the heart. Mediastinum is the region that holds the heart. These are just definitions you need to know. Heart location, it's not symmetrical. Okay, it's focused on the left side, and the tidal volume of the left lung is actually less than the right lung because of the influence of the heart. We'll talk more about this with respiration, but we're going to see that the left lung actually has 2 lobes, whereas the right lung has 3 lobes. Just stock definitions. Okay, pericardium. So the heart's going to become bigger and smaller, right? It's going to expand and contract. Well, think about the heart getting bigger and smaller. Does it need to push a lot of tissue out of the way when it does this? No. No. It needs a nice zone to itself that it become bigger and smaller and do that with relative ease. Okay? That's what the pericardium is going to provide. It's going to provide a buffer zone, a sac that the heart sits in. And as the heart becomes larger and smaller, it's not bumping into the viscera. It's not bumping into the lungs and the diaphragm. It's like a nice zone around the heart that it can move around in with relative ease. So kind of think of it like as a balloon, right? That pericardial cavity. And think of your fist going down in that balloon. That balloon is the pericardium. The different parts of the pericardium have different names. The outer part of the pericardium is the parietal pericardium. The inner part is the visceral pericardium. And the stuff inside is the pericardial cavity. Now, sometimes that pericardial cavity can fill with blood, for example, from a stabbing injury, and that has to actually be drained. Okay. Also, you can get a bacterial infection or viral infection. When that happens, it's going to interfere with how well the heart beats because it's pushing pressure on the heart. Okay. Fibrous pericardium is the surrounding part. This is going to surround the heart, and it's going to be just a bag around the heart. This is the outermost part of the pericardium. Okay. Pericardial fluid is what? Just the fluid inside the pericardium. Peritonitis and inflamed pericardium. You can read these definitions. Just, know the definitions. Okay, the heart has layers. Okay, the heart has layers. We're going to start from the outermost layer and work our way in. The outermost external layer is the epicardium. This is going to be close to the pericardium, and this has to be smooth, because think about it. The heart, right, is beating in the pericardium. The outside of the heart has to be smooth, so there's very little friction between the heart, right, and the pericardial cavity as it moves in that pericardium. So this outside layer is really, really smooth. And you think about that heart becoming bigger and smaller in the sac. If it was rough on the outside, that wouldn't be good because it'd be like sandpaper moving up and down. Cause friction, cause heat, not be good. But no, the epicardium is smooth. It allows for the nice flow of the heart inside the pericardial cavity, inside the pericardium. Okay. Myocardium, this is the musculature of the heart. Most of the heart is made up of myocardium. When you look at it on a macro level like this, it actually has this swirling bundles. Okay, it's not just like thick muscle, it swirls. Okay, then inside we got the endocardium. Endocardium is what the valves and parts of the heart connect to. Okay. Know all 4 chambers of the heart and what they do. With this information, you can synthesize what each chamber does. Atriums receive things. Ventricles pump things. Right side's oxygen poor, left side's oxygen rich. For example, What's the left ventricle going to do? Well, it's going to pump oxygen-rich blood into the systematic circuit. What does the right atrium do? It's going to receive oxygen-poor blood. Okay, that's the kind of question you're going to see. Okay, the cardiac cycle. Here, and we're going to talk about this later on, understand that the cardiac cycle is this. We're talking about this with the pacemaker, but we'll say it right here too. The atriums fill up, and the atriums then pump into the ventricles, and then the ventricles pump out. The atriums and the ventricles do not pump at the same time. Their action is bifurcated, because if the atrium and ventricle pumped at the same time, the atrium would be pumping into a squeezed-in ventricle, so they can't pump at the same time. There's a split between atrial and ventricular contraction. Talk about that later. Okay, know the systematic and pulmonary circuits. Do you see in the diagram to the right, 1, 2, 6, and 7? Those are the chambers of the heart. I expect you to be able to know this diagram for the test. Not only this diagram, you should know the bicuspid valve, the tricuspid valve. By the way, that bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve, know this diagram. We talked about this a lot in class. We drew a picture on the board. Know the diagram, right? Know what the systematic circuit is. Know what the pulmonary circuit is. Be able to identify veins. Be able to identify arteries. Okay, so let's start with number 1, the right atrium. Right atrium is going to pump its blood into what? The tricuspid through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it leaves the pulmonary valve, which is a semilunar valve. It goes through what? Arteries. Arteries carrying oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. That's number 4. The oxygen comes into the blood, CO2 leaves. Number 5, that oxygenated blood goes from the lungs to the heart, to the pulmonary veins, goes to the left atrium, goes to the bicuspid valve, the mitral valve, if you will, left ventricle, from the left ventricle out the aortic valve, which is a semilunar valve, to the aorta, then the arteries, arterioles, capillary beds, does its thing, venules, veins. Ultimately, it comes back to 3 veins, the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And those 3 veins draw into the right atrium. You should know this cycle. I'll leave it at that. Okay, now, the heart provides a propulsive force for blood. Okay? But it's just not the heart providing the propulsive force. Around arteries, there is elastic tissue. And as the heart beats, it's going to expand the artery. And as it expands the artery, it stretches out this elastic tissue. And that stretch is called compliance. Okay, then your heart stops beating, right? Diastole. When you're in diastole, what happens? Your heart's no longer providing a propulsive force forward for your blood. But your blood still moves because that elastic tissue pops back into place like a rubber band or a rubber hose. And that coming in will lessen the volume inside and provide a propulsive force for the blood to move forward. Okay? So because of this, what do we have? Our blood goes fast, slow, because we have the elastic tissue around the arteries, which has compliance, and it expands. Think of this as a rubber hose. The heart and systole, it pumps the blood, and it's going to make that elastic tissue stretch out like a rubber hose and stretch it wide. Okay, and you stop that pump. And what happens? That elastic tissue, it will go back into place. And as it goes back into place and becomes smaller, the interior volume becomes less inside the artery, and that less volume propels the blood forward inside. Okay? But the key point here is what? Blood flow is fast, slow, fast, slow. It is not stop, go, stop, go. The fast part of the blood, that's from the action of the heart. The slow part is from that elastic tissue around the arteries coming back from that stretch position and giving a small propulsive force to the blood. Okay. We know this. Oh, right here. Also know that what? How veins, at least in the systematic circuit, work. There's very little blood pressure past the capillaries. So you have to have smooth or muscle around the veins to squeeze the blood forward. Blood pressure, again, this is the amount of blood, the pressure the heart exerts to the blood. Notice there is systole and diastole, or systolic and diastolic. The systolic is when your heart squeezes. The diastolic is when your heart relaxes. See that kind of like sinusoidal wave to it? Okay? See how it goes fast, slow, fast, slow? Okay. Another thing, look what's happening to the pressure. We have the highest pressure coming off the arteries, and then the lowest pressure in the veins. It's going to lose a lot of pressure as it goes through the capillary beds and through the body. And because it's less pressure, you know, the veins have to have those muscles around them to push the blood forward. Okay? Take-home point here is blood pressure changes, highest coming off the heart, lowest coming into the heart. Okay. Auricle, this is just a bag that fills with blood. It's in the atriums. Okay? Blood coming into the atriums is fairly low pressure, so you know it can fill in this little pouch. Sulcus or sulculi or sulci, any way you want to call it. These are grooves on the heart that contain the coronary blood vessels. You see a heart, these will actually be covered with fatty tissue. You'd have to pull away the fatty tissue to see it. Coronary sulcus, this is a groove that separates the atrium and the ventricles. And you can get those definitions yourself. Okay. Okay, so now what we're going to do is talk about the parts. We have what? 4 parts of the heart, right? The right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. We're going to talk about each one of those chambers. We talked about them somewhat a few minutes ago, but now we're going to talk more in depth about them. Right atrium receives blood. Well, let me say this. The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from the systematic circuit. The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from the systematic circuit. Your muscles, your viscera, that type of stuff. Okay. It comes in through 3 veins. Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Okay, you can see the definitions, but it's blood from the top, blood from the bottom, and then the coronary sinus. The heart is a muscle. Okay, it's it has that myocardium to it, right? It's a lot of muscle. It has to be fed by blood. The heart cannot get oxygen by diffusion through the blood inside. The heart has its own series of veins and arteries that carry blood through the heart. After blood has moved through the heart and become deoxygenated, it will eventually terminate in the coronary sinus. Okay, so the coronary sinus contains used blood from the heart muscle itself. Pectinate, these are just muscular ridges in the heart. What's the point here? In the right atrium, the intraatrial septum, which is just a wall between the 2 atriums, or the atria, there is a large hole before birth, the foramen ovule. This one, it allows a flow of blood between right and left atrium. This is before your lungs have developed. Okay. After you're born, your lungs are developed. This closes off and forms a fossa rather than a foramen. Okay. So the tricuspid valve, you'll sometimes call this an AV valve, an atrioventricular valve. Okay. Atrium to the ventricle, so it's an AV valve, or also called a tricuspid valve. This valve will close off the atrium and the ventricle. Trabecular carne, these are muscular ridges inside, just know the definition. Okay, now this is going to apply both to the right and left side. That tricuspid valve is made up of cuspids, and a cuspid's a leaf-like part of it, or leaflet, I should say. The tricuspid valve has 3 of those. The bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve, has 2 of those. Okay? These tricuspid valves are controlled by, well, heartstrings, if you will, chordae tendineae, and these are going to open and close off these valves. The muscles that contract to do this, to close these tricuspid valves off, are the palpatory muscles. Pulmonary valve. This is a semilunar valve. Pulmonary valve is what the blood from the right ventricle leaves through. Okay. Now, let's compare the left ventricle to the right ventricle. 2 important considerations here. The musculature around the right ventricle. Okay? The right ventricle is pumping blood from the heart to the lungs. The left ventricle is pumping blood from the heart to throughout the body, the brain, the stomach, the gut, muscles in the legs. Which one is going to have more muscle? Well, the left ventricle is going to pump it through more of the body than the right ventricle. So the left ventricle is more musculature, has more muscle development than the right ventricle. Now, that's all good and well, but how about the amount of blood? Does the left ventricle have more blood than the right, or does the right have more than the left? Well, the answer to that is they have about the same amount of blood. Okay. Okay, so now the heart has pumped, through the lungs, and now what's happened is, okay, let me go to this one right here. So leaving the right ventricle, the blood goes to the lungs, it gets oxygenated and comes back to the heart. What's next? The left atrium. So here blood has come to the heart from the lungs in an oxygenated form. Left atrium pretty similar to the right atrium. After blood has gone to the left atrium will pump it through a bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle. Same principles before as how that bicuspid valve here opens up. Okay, I want to make sure. Okay, trying to hit the high point here. Okay, semilunar valve. We talked about these. I talked about the bicuspids and tricuspids. Bicuspid and tricuspids are AV valves. They separate the atrium and the ventricles. Semilunar valves separate the ventricles to the circuit. Okay. This is going to separate, for example, the blood coming out of the heart going to the lungs and the blood coming out from the heart going to the rest of the body. So that's what semilunar valves do. Coronary circulation, that's what controls the heart, or that's the blood for the heart. Coronary circulation is the blood that feeds the heart muscle. Okay, the next several slides, and I'm going to go through these real fast, is how the heart controls its rhythm. 2 things here. The heart is myogenic. That means that the signal for a heartbeat comes from the heart itself. Okay, that's important. The heart is myogenic. It determines its beat. Beat. Beat, beat. Now, the rate at which the heart beats, different thing. The brain, the central nervous system controls how fast the heart beats or how slow the heart beats. Okay? Beat, 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 or beat, beat, beat. How fast those come and how slow those come, that is the heartbeat, right? What controls the speed of the heart rate is the central nervous system. What controls the heart beating for one beat, that's the heart itself. Okay, brain controls rate, heart controls the beat. Okay, so how does it control the beat? Well, it all has to do with something that's called the pacemaker system. Important consideration here is, and we'll talk about this as we go through the slides, but just know this. The atriums contract first, then the ventricles. This system, one of the key features is that it separates the contraction of the atrium and then the ventricles. It allows the atrium to contract, then the ventricles to contract. If the atrium and ventricles contracted at the same time, that wouldn't work. Because what's going to happen? You'd be pumping into a squeezed up, smaller chamber. So that's not going to work. So this system is going to allow a separation between contraction. It allows the atrium to contract and then the ventricles. Okay. So it all begins in the SA node, in the right atrium, or atrial wall. It's that little red dot at the far left, and that will send out an electrical impulse, and that will cause all of the cells in the atrium at the top to contract. As they contract, the blood flows through the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Okay. That signal then will reach the AV node, the second part of this, and it will kind of sit on the signal for a second. Okay, a slight delay is put into the signal, or into the node. Because of that delay, it will delay the contraction of the ventricles, and this is where that separation happens. Okay, this is why there is a slight delay between the contraction of the atrium and the contraction of the ventricles. Past that, it goes through the bundle of His, and then down the Purkinje fibers around the heart, and it will signal the ventricles to contract. And that is the cardiac cycle. Okay, so the SA node is the pacemaker. The AV node will then send that signal to the ventricles. Okay, you talked about your EKG in lab. I know you have, so I just put the slides here. You're responsible for it, but we will not go over it because you have had this in lab, and you actually should have done an EKG in lab. Okay. We talked about the cardiac cycle, and you should have talked about heart sounds in your class. Cardiac output is the amount of blood left from the left or right ventricle, and then the stroke volume is the amount of blood released per contraction. Okay, and that, we did not have time to cover the rest of this, so that will pretty much be it. Okay, and I hope you do well on your test, and I'll see you on test day.